Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Arcane Games and Events YouTube channel. It is a beautiful Wednesday here in Southern California. It is a slightly less beautiful, but I'm sure still very gorgeous day in New Zealand, which is where our very special guest is coming to us from. This is Bryan Gottlieb, senior game designer and co-lead developer at Legend Story Studios, if I'm getting that right. I know it's always a mouthful.
I forget all the time too. So just say whatever you want. It's fine. I do something. I know that.
I'm in good company. That's excellent. Bryan, you have put enough data of your face and voice on the internet at this point to make a deep fake probably 20 times over, all in
That's
the
scary.
name of this game that we all love. Yeah, and we're actually working on one right now. We're trying to get it to say
Please
chain
don't.
is my main and ain't that insane.
Mm,
Can't quite get past that sentence. Um,
that's probably for the best. I dread that technology becoming omnipresent, especially as it relates to my own internet presence.
there's no way it can do what you do at LSS though, and that
Maybe
is,
I might just be replaced seamlessly. Honestly, just put in AI Brian and you wouldn't even
I
notice.
don't buy it
Just
for a second,
exact same
not
thing.
even for a second. Well, in the interest of saying making you say some things that AI maybe can't make you say, I'd like to talk first a little bit about who the Bryan Gottlieb is that is not his job, that is not the senior game designer and lead developer at Legend Story Studios. So first of all, Bryan, let's start with kind of an overarching question that I grapple with personally a lot. Why card games? Why devote your life to this?
Yeah, it honestly doesn't feel like a conscious decision I made. It's just like I was young, almost actually 30 plus years ago now, and discovered this thing of Magic the Gathering. And it was like, this is it for me. This just ticks every box I ever wanted ticked. It is exactly uh, how I want to spend not only my actual like in-person time, but my mental time. It's the thing I want to be obsessing over, thinking about. And that has never stopped, even in moments where I kind of needed it to stop, where I had like other professional responsibilities. It was just like, well, I am qualified for this pro tour though. Like, do I really need to be at this really important meeting? And I'm like, no, I don't. I will just go and do this thing instead because it is such a fundamental part of my like not only personality but social scene uh mode of thinking. It shapes the way I view like all other things around me. It is just sometimes you just find the thing that like clicks with your soul, with the way you view the world. And it was TCGs for me, going on 30 years now.
And you're in good company. I'm in the same boat. And I guess what I'm trying to tap into is like what was that quintessential moment? I guess while you were sitting down playing Magic, like when what was the moment where it all clicked and why? Like I'm trying to connect maybe with like what it is for a chess player. And for me, like if I were to put it in their head, maybe it's that you sit down across from somebody and it's even stakes. Like besides who goes first, there is no advantage except for
Mm,
what's in your own brain in that game. Card games is a little bit different in that regard, but also like it captures something in us. And what is it for you?
I think it's probably more than anything else that state of perpetual change and sort of never being comfortable with the terms of engagement and letting them constantly evolve and adapt. You mentioned chess. It's really funny. People who don't yet know me really well and they know my background in gaming, know how much I love gaming. They go, "Oh, you must love chess." No, I hate it. I have no interest in chess whatsoever. Like it just has never, and I've tried, like, because I sort of feel this pressure to give in to that notion of, oh, I should really love chess. I don't. It just doesn't appeal to me. And it is because it feels often rehearsed. And this is not to demean chess in any way or chess players. Like I understand how special of a game it is. I understand it has levels of depth that I can't even comprehend. Um, but there is a staticness to it that just didn't hook me. It didn't draw me in. And I see it replicated in all aspects of my life. I generally do not like things to be the same. I want to experience everything. I want to play every video game. My Steam catalog is way too big and it shows a lot of 35 minutes, 40 minutes in this game. But I like that. I like just getting a taste, diving and experiencing something new. And with TCGs, you can sort of commit yourself to this core system, the one whose mechanics really speak to you, and still get rewarded with this ever evolving thing. And that seems almost like obvious at this point, but you have to remember at the point that I found TCGs in my life, not all games were like this. In fact, basically no games were like this. And, as somebody who was obsessed with video games, I don't know, we're probably in like the maybe Sega Genesis ish era for me at this point, where we're
An
talking
amazing era, by
94
the
or
way.
so. Yeah, absolutely. But you got a cartridge and that cartridge remained the same and you plugged it in your thing. I know this sounds ancient to folks out there listening right now, but like the game was static. It was always going to be the same thing. And this concept of a game that could always evolve and always offer me something new was just immediately appealing to me.
So it kind of ties in somewhat to, I mean, the revolution of maybe open world games a little bit. Like this concept of like is this the procedurally generated world before computers could keep up with that kind of thing?
I think so. I think like it's funny because obviously TCGs and specifically Magic, the first TCG, are held in very high regard in terms of their influence over the gaming world at this point. But I still think there's moments where they don't get enough credit. I think so much of how gaming is shaped right now owes everything to those first few TCGs. And I would also point to Magic Online as another like fundamental shift in how games are done. This world of digital economies and owning things that you don't actually own, for better or for worse. It has a lot of proof of concept in early Magic Online, and all of these sort of loot boxy systems and elements of roguelike design. I mean, we can just point to games that are just hard coded with cards, right? Things like Slay the Spire and Monster Train is another one I really love that comes to mind.
That
All
was a
these things.
blast.
Oh, so yeah, I was obsessed with that game for a very long period of time. All these things are so rooted in this fundamental evolution of TCGs, and it almost doesn't get enough respect, despite being everywhere. How much they change the world.
You're already firing me up right now. Like these are the thoughts that have been exploding out of my brain since I got obsessed with Magic as well. It's so much fun. But let's pivot away from card games for just a second, Brian. One of the other aspects of your personality is that you're an animal lover. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I again, it doesn't feel like a conscious choice. I just have always loved animals. They are there's a level of simplicity in interacting with animals that just again feels right to me. Particularly dogs. Love dogs. Any dog on the street, I make eye contact with immediately, and I'm convinced they all want to be my best friend. You can't tell me otherwise.
I wouldn't
Um,
dare.
but yeah, there's something very beautiful and pure about the way they communicate and the way they engage with the world. And I I wouldn't focus only on dogs because when you look for these tendencies in other animals, in all animals, like animals that we don't really like train ourselves to view that way, you see them. You see like compassion and joy in all animals. And I've been a vegetarian for about 7 years now. I would like to be vegan, but I really like cheese, and I just am not. I can't get that far. I would love to, maybe someday. But there there's just this kind of undeniable realness for animals that has always been present for me, and I bore this tremendous guilt my entire life about how I was interacting with animals. Right, like I profess to have this love for them, and then I sit down and have a steak, and at some point I realized that I wasn't being true to who I was. And that's why I decided to make this shift. And I try really hard to like not be preachy about it because like I don't look down on people who don't see it the same way. I think we're conditioned to see things certain ways. And, there's probably some biological imperatives that drive us to uh, cultivate meat and engage with it that way. But I think all I would say to people is like, ask yourself these questions and be true to yourself. And I found so much more happiness at the moment where I was just like, I know that I've lived my life this way. And I know like I enjoy the taste of these things, but this doesn't feel like who I'm supposed to be. And that's the moment I shifted, and I just can't fathom doing it any other way at this point. So
Do you have any pets, Bryan?
I do not at the moment. Being split between two places is tough. I would surround myself with dogs if I could. My best friend passed away about 2 years ago. I still think about him every day. I have paintings and drawings of him all over my house. His name was Kai. He was the best dog in the entire world. And I would love to fill that Kai-shaped hole in my heart with a million dogs if I could. But spending time in New Zealand and New York makes it really, really tough to do that. Someday, though, I promise you, I'll have an army of Labrador retrievers on my property. And I've even talked. I could see myself very much at some point. And it's weird because sometimes I just say shit and I have no plan to do it and like no pathway to doing it. But I find like I get there sometimes, like just things work out in such a way, and I find like a moment of dedication or a particular relationship that allows me to pursue these things, kind of like how I got involved with game design. But I can absolutely see myself having like an animal sanctuary someday and just looking out for animals that don't have any other home.
This takes me to a quote that I have of you, where you said you can't wait for the day where you quote "fuck off into the sun" unquote
Mm,
and
mm.
do something else. I think you were specifically talking about your social media presence, which you have done for a lot of years, both personally and on behalf of LSS. Essentially, is that what that looks like for you? An animal
Probably.
sanctuary?
Yeah, probably. It is somewhat rooted in nature. And like it's very I want to be very clear that that statement is pointed specifically at kind of like the being a public person and not so much the designing games aspect, because I love that shit. I could do this forever and do it very happily. Um, but it is hard sometimes to kind of like put yourself out there as the face of something. It can be challenging and draining. And I also appreciate all the opportunities it creates for me. Like I'm not blind to those things. I am very privileged in the things I've been able to experience because I have kind of a footprint in these scenes. In fact, I wouldn't have this job if not for the fact that I cultivated a social media presence. And James was able to reach out to me and be like, "Do you want to talk about working for us?" If I'm not vocal and present on social media spaces, that does not happen. So there's a lot of good that comes from it. But I think about simple lives rooted in like nature and animals and absent this global web of interconnectivity, and they have a lot of appeal for me for sure.
And I should clarify, when you said that, even though you used crass language, it made me want that for you, Bryan, in a certain way. Like I want you to be here for obvious reasons, but also I was like, I wonder what that looks like for Bryan, and that was a beautiful image, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
I'll get it too. Like when the
Yeah.
time is right, I will do that. And it's just I have a lot of stuff I still want to do in the space, and I'm confident that at some point when I've done everything I need to do and I feel good about it, then I will happily fuck off into the sun, and it'll be great.
And I'll watch you go with glee. And speaking of that, I think you're tapping into it a little bit with one of those non-traditional pets that you were talking about. It's not stopping you from forming relationships with animals, namely a little raccoon that what hangs around
Mm.
your place sometimes.
Yeah, all the time. There's actually a family of them. It's like three or four raccoons that come quite regularly. So we have some feral cats on my property. My property is very rural in upstate New York, and we just noticed a bunch of cats coming around, and we slowly befriended them. And in fact, even now we have an automatic feeder set up for them at our house, and somebody comes and fills it to make sure the feral cats are taken care of while we're here in New Zealand. But raccoons love that shit as well, and they are very ready to come and partake in some cat food. And the raccoon has been my favorite animal for a very long time. Not only do I have this particular family of raccoons at my property right now, but when I lived in Seattle, I actually the first time I went to Vancouver was for a Magic Pro Tour, and I sort of just heard this swirling rumor of a park in Vancouver where the raccoons had been there so long and had been fed by people for so long that they were certainly wild, but like they would come up to you and take some food from you if they wanted to, and do so somewhat gently. So I went to after the Magic Pro Tour, I went to Stanley Park in Vancouver and met this family of raccoons, which does in fact just take food out of your hands. And you probably should
Wow.
not do this. I'll disclaim this, but it's fucking awesome. And I had a really good time. And I used to drive up from Seattle literally to just go see these raccoons and feed them for the day. It's like a 3 or 4 hour drive or whatever. Totally worth it.
In Japan, they've got very polite deer that come up and ask for cookies.
Mm,
In the U.S., we've got trash pandas that you can
yep.
feed by hand.
Yeah,
Well,
I'll go check out those deer when I'm in Japan as well, for sure. Heading to Nara and seeing how that goes.
it is.
Again, like there's something wrong about that whole scenario, like the touristy vibe of it and like feeding the deer. It's probably not right. And don't do what I'm doing, but I'm going to do it.
Yeah, but it's there, and how could you possibly not?
Right.
It's also much safer, and I will say probably less magical than feeding raccoons in Seattle. But maybe that's our own personal opinion, Brian.
Mm,
So moving on, I mean, you have this really intimate relationship with animals. You also are an incredibly protective person about the people that you work with, and you've spoken about this a lot. But what I want to know is there someone in your life or a particular experience with maybe someone in your own position in relation to you that instilled this as a core value for you?
uh, I think that's a good question. I will say nothing. No one particular thing springs to mind, but I think back on how I lived my like early 20s, and I was uh, very successful at poker at the time. I was brash. I was arrogant. I was rude. I uh, I think I just like kind of put myself and my happiness above everything else, and I was miserable, like just miserable. And at some point, I realized that I only felt good when I was looking out for other people, when I was helping other people, do the things they wanted to achieve, when I was protecting other people, when I was providing for other people. Like that is when I really found fulfillment. And that realization again just kind of changed the way I wanted to live my life. I knew if I was going to have my own struggles, like I wanted to do everything possible to make other people's struggles less. And I think that's where it comes from when I like think back to both like being bullied or bullying someone else, which I was certainly guilty of at points in my life. Um, like the impact of that, and if I can find ways to stop that, even in like professional situations, because I do think there are times that the relationship between uh, consumer and game maker crosses the line to bullying. And I'll be frank, I think it's a very minor aspect of the flesh and blood community. It almost
Mm.
never happens to me. I'm actually very proud of the flesh and blood community for that. But I see other games I play and it's horrible and it's brutal. So I see even like a little hint of that in the flesh and blood space. I get really angry and really protective, and I want to keep that out of our scene. Um, but I don't think it was like a specific incident. I can't think of a person though. Like working with Jerry Thompson on my last podcast, uh, he and I just before we started working together, we knew of each other. We weren't close. We didn't know each other that well, but we had such a similar approach to uh, basically this exact scenario I'm describing, where we have like our own internal struggles and we have this revelation independently of each other, like, oh, actually, I feel good when I help other people. And we both kind of like pushed each other to pursue that and engage with that and think about that. And I think having a friend that saw the world the same way I did and like embraced those principles, and there's certainly the influence of toxic masculinity in these male to male friendships that we make. And they're often, especially when I think of my prior friendships, my friendships growing up, they're rooted in don't show emotion, you don't be vulnerable, always be strong. And having like a real male friendship that I could put all that aside with and actually engage with like my true self was really, really valuable for me.
And also just informs so much of the way that you communicate with the flesh and blood community. and the way I guess there's a certain protectiveness that I sense in you about the game as well as the rest of your team. What were you connecting with that newfound sense of self when you agreed to come on at LSS? Like when you were doing contract work, was there a sense in you that like this felt special and it was something that you wanted a hand in cultivating and protecting and growing?
From a gameplay perspective at that point, yes. Like it felt like a very uh, big step forward for a TCG to so many TCGs are essentially magic rehashes. And I don't mean that again to be diminutive of them. It takes a lot to make a really good magic rehash, but they are drawing off a lot of the same fundamentals. And what I saw with Flesh and Blood was something that was willing to create its own fundamentals. It's not unheard of, but a lot of them fail. A lot of them are not very interesting. And here was one that went out on its own path and did it unbelievably well in a really, really exciting way. So from a gameplay perspective, I immediately had that draw. But at this point, I don't know the people, right? I don't know who's actually making this game. I hadn't met James and didn't know anything about him, and I didn't know the rest of the team, certainly. So it was just like this superficial thing. But then I do this work and I meet the people and I get to know James, and I'm like, well, not only is this game something special, this company is something special, and these people are something special. And they care about their consumers and they want to do something good, and they're at their core fundamentally good people.
Mm.
That's when it turns from like, oh, I want to nourish this game and tell people about this game to, no, I want to nourish this company and protect this company because I know how hard they work. I know how much they care about what they're making. That I don't think I would have come online as heartily as I did if I was not able to make that aspect of the relationship as well. Like that's what really locked me into, I'm going to be doing this for a long time.
Yeah, because they're connecting with that same thing that you found in your friend at the podcast. They're like lifting you up to be the person that you want to be, and it's so powerful when you can have somebody to grab hold on to, and lift you up because you can lift them up at the same time.
No, I think that's exactly right.
That's awesome. Let's turn our attention to your fears. You don't strike me as a fearful person. You're not scared of anything. However, I think you're very astutely aware of your fears, especially when it comes to down the line what Flesh and Blood could be and what could harm it. And your fears seem to be some of your biggest motivators. Maybe that's an overreach from me, but could you talk about like what are your biggest fears in regards to Flesh and Blood, and why are they at bay working with LSS?
Mm. There's always an omnipresent fear when you are making a product within capitalism that the capitalistic nature of that product can consume the artistic or gameplay merit of the thing. And I basically feel like I've been through this with Magic. Magic was something I, saw from its minuscule roots, had this incredible passion for. And this is not to take shots at Magic. I think they have accomplished a tremendous amount. I think what they do is extremely impressive, but they are making a very different product than the one I fell in love with. I think they're making this mass market amalgam product that is designed to appeal to as broad an audience as possible. And
Mm.
that's a great thing. Like it is an accomplishment in and of itself. But I do think for me, some of the realness of it has evaporated. Some of what I fell in love with has evaporated. And I don't think it was an intentional fuck the core of Magic, let's make a bunch of money. Because it's the same people who have the same love for Magic that I do. And I know a lot of people who work there. I know they hold that same thing within them. But the wheels of a corporation and capitalism can spin and they can drag you into these places. And frankly, a lot of times with a publicly traded company, you don't have a choice. Like you are just driven to seek this profit and you have to. And that is the reality of the world you're existing in. So do I fear that for Flesh and Blood? Like abstractly, I do. It would be heartbreaking to see that ever occur. Do I think that's going to occur, knowing what I know about the company, knowing the people involved with the company? No, I don't. I really don't. Because that's not to say we are blind to making money. You cannot run a successful TCG without making money. We have to pay salaries of all the people who make this incredible game. And that's obviously got to be something that drives us. But never, ever have we made a single decision where it's like, well, this will harm the game long term, without a doubt, or it'll make it something that we didn't want it to be, but it'll make us a lot of money. So let's just do it. Like, it is much more nuanced than that. It is designed to be a balance of how do we make enough money to, you know, keep the wheels rolling, keep expanding, which we certainly want to do. We want to do more and more. How do you do that and do so in a way that is true to the game? And I think we've done a really good job of that thus far. But that is a huge fear. Like, that is something that kind of looms because I had this game that I loved so much, in very much the same way I love Flesh and Blood, go through that. And it's scary. It can be like a really hard thing to build your personality around an endeavor. And then you wake up one day and you're like, well, this isn't the thing I thought I was signing up for. And it was especially hard for me. And I think this is a really important point when it comes to like how I've engaged in discourse in the past and how I kind of hold myself up as maybe a bad example of how you can engage with the game. Because when Magic was starting down this path, I was very vocal and I was concerned, and I wrote articles complaining about it. And I tried to do so in a fair way, in a productive way, certainly in a way that never attacked anyone. I wrote an article, encourage people to read it if they're interested in kind of how I engage with this, called "I Just Want to Love Constructed Magic Again." You can still find it. It's out there. And it was long, and it was just kind of like laying out my problems with where things were. And, I did so in as a respectful as a way as I could. But the reality is, what I was supposed to be doing in that moment was just walking away, because I didn't have any control in that situation. And frankly, I knew why they were making the decisions they were making. Like, they were purpose driven decisions. They weren't mistakes. They were doing something that I didn't agree with. So to me, the correct thing for me to do would just be like, go do something else. At that point in time, though, I was writing articles, getting paid quite well to do so. I was podcasting, getting paid quite well to do so. I was broadcasting Magic games, again, getting paid very well. And I had made this career for myself out of something that for the first time in my life, something that I just unabashedly loved. It was exactly where I wanted to be. And I saw the writing on the wall that, oh, this career is not going to be here long term. It is going to crumble because this is shifting in a different way. And just from dollars coming into my bank account in the moment scenario, I couldn't walk away. I was there. Like, I was making too much money to walk away at that point. And I didn't have my next thing at that point.
And
So
why
it
would
kind
you
of
want to
forced
have your
me,
next thing when this is
right,
the
you
thing you've
want to
always
fix this
wanted?
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was kind of like priced in, and the only way I could engage with this thing was to be sort of vocally negative about it. But for my happiness, I should have just walked away. That would have been the best thing to do in that moment.
You've touched on something so raw, and that I think connects with insecurity in relationships, in your job, in all aspects of human life, which is, I'm out of control here. And knowing what you know now on the dev side of things, you could even be at the helm of something like this and not be in full control of it. Um, so it makes sense that that is the highest tier fear for something you care about and love.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is kind of small potatoes. And it's funny you mentioned that, like, I seem to be someone without fear. I think that is only because my actual fears are so much bigger than the things I'm engaging with on a day to day basis. Like, my fears are existentialist and, does humanity have a future and these type of things. That's what actually keeps me up at night, in terms of like, was this card supposed to cost 2 instead of 1? It's like, well, maybe it was, but like, in the end, we're all going to die anyway. So who really cares, right? Like, that's kind of my perspective on all of this stuff.
Some gallows humor in there. I love that. So,
Yeah.
well, that's interesting, Brian, because like if your bigger fears are the big picture things, is the earth going to melt tomorrow? Is I don't know. Is it are my family of raccoons are going to have a place to live in X number of years? Why have you devoted yourself to something that, like, I don't know, I guess an environmental scientist might point to as trivial.
Yeah, I think it is because there are no answers to those big concerns that I have. There's nothing I can do to engage with them. So again, it kind of goes back to like, if you have these sort of dreads and you have these infirmities inside you, like, what is the way you are supposed to live your life? Are you supposed to let them consume you, or you do find ways to bring other people joy and
Mm.
that they can escape from these same things that we all share? And that is how I've chosen to shape my life. And that's how I've chosen to find peace under this kind of like looming umbrella of dread. There's this safety in just being like, well, let's escape for a little while. Let's do something cool. Let's do something we can all share. And, why do that? The other alternative is curl up into a ball and be overwhelmed. And like, that's just not what I want to do. I want to do something more meaningful than that.
I'm thinking of our dear friend in the inertia token right now.
Mm,
I hope they get out from under that table one day.
yeah, one day. We're all pulling for them.
Well, thanks, Bryan, for giving us a glimpse into the Bryan that's not um, the senior developer at LFS, the Bryan that's just Bryan. Um, from there, let's go ahead and move into your actual job. Now we want to hear about the Bryan that does do some development.
Mhm.
And I want to focus a lot of this discussion on the craft part of development of game design. And what I mean by that is like the nuts and bolts, the nitty gritty, the techniques, the organization, the people that make this game day in and day out. And one of the biggest questions in my mind about this, which vexes me to this day, is what the heck is the difference between design and development?
That is a beautiful question, and one that I get asked a lot, and one that I do think has like a pretty pointed answer if you accept that the two flow into each other to some extent.
I
But
can accept this.
design's purpose is to create out of thin air these cards, these concepts, be they top down or bottom up designs, meaning they're designed to capture a concept, or if they're just designed to have a mechanical purpose and then you fill in the concept on top of that. Either way, design is making those things appear out of thin air.
Hmm.
Development is making those things work within the rules, making them balanced within the game system, and making them fun. And obviously, you cannot do one without the other. When you are designing a card, you're not making a card that says, when you play this, win the game. You are inherently developing it as you sculpt it. But your focus has to be on the creative process. And I think it's almost good to sort of put that aside a lot of the times and just be like, this is the concept I want. It might be completely fucked in terms of how powerful it is, but let's get this concept out there and let's figure out how to make this something we can sustain within our game.
Hmm.
And then development is answering those questions. How do we unfuck this? And, both are critical and they both have their own really, really big challenges. And they tax different areas of the brain, honestly, and I think that's why I like being involved on both sides. It really does just pose a never-ending set of challenges.
And I'm sure coaxes you into a lot of idle hours around the pond, kind of considering.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, a
so
lot of walks around the property.
so maybe at this point we can you give me let's picture this, Bryan. Let's picture we have a flesh and blood card that we all know and love. Let's call it I don't know, Wounded Bull. Let's put a blank piece of paper on an easel in an office at LSS. What I'm looking here is like a rough timeline of how this card comes from an idea in somebody's brain to being spit out on the production line. Um, who are the people and in what rough order come into that office, slap the stats, then the art, the flavor text, the everything that makes a flesh and blood card. At what point does the unfucking department come in and make it more reasonable or whatever? Like from point A to point Z, how do these cards get made?
Yeah, that is again a great question, and one that I think it's going to be illuminating to a lot of people. I'm happy to answer it because I don't know that anyone, it's not something that I have avoided sharing, but I don't know that everyone's ever asked it in such a direct fashion before. The vast, vast majority of Flesh and Blood cards are being made by James. The vast majority. And that is him going, he calls it the design tank, kind of goes away. We don't hear from him for a while, weeks, months. And I shouldn't say we don't hear from him. We don't hear from him on this particular thing he's working on. We'll talk about other things. But he goes into the design tank and he comes out with what is usually a pretty fulsome set. It's got heroes. It's got almost always all the commons, rares, some majestics sprinkled in, some legendaries sprinkled in. I wouldn't say all of them, but they're present. And that forms our baseline. And, sometimes I'm contributing to that process. I contribute a lot actually in what I would term just stolen from the way Wizards terms it, vision design, where we're kind of laying out the bones of a set. And I say, well, what if we told this story and we expressed it through this mechanic? And, we do a lot of brainstorming and scribbling on walls together where we sort of paint these broad pictures and lay out our far in advance timelines of the stories we want to tell. So I might be involved in that aspect, but a lot of these baseline cards are just coming from James and his he just has such a mastery over this game system, right? He's been at this for so long and knows the limits, knows how much you can do, what you can and can't get away with, and has considered so many things at this point. And he uses that to come up with these baseline shells. And at that point, we'll usually go to an alpha phase, and that involves myself, my fellow lead developer, Chris Gehring, usually James, some of our senior devs, folks like Jason Chung, Carol, who have been here for a very long time. We'll kind of lock ourselves away again from the broader team and just experiment. We'll play some, faux sealed pools. We'll play first glimpses at constructed to sort of understand how things are working. And there'll always be some rough edges coming out of alpha phase. You'll have some things that will stand out to you. And it also does a really good job of setting the table for how we're going to go to development phase, the type of things we want to focus on, the type of things we feel are going to have to be smoothed out and answered along the way. And then at that point, we will bring it to the broader development team and we'll sort of, as a group, set some goals, set some expectations for what we're trying to do. Think about that. As I mentioned, at this point, there's probably some holes in the map. We might be missing some legendaries, some majestics. Start working on filling that in. We know these heroes a little bit now. We know this map a little bit better and what we want to achieve. So we start floating some ideas, and that's when I'll start getting more involved in the sort of create a card aspect of design. And not only myself, but Chris Gehring will do a lot of it, and the broader dev team also contributing ideas throughout of, hey, we can fill holes this way. And we'll start piecing more and more things together. And then obviously from that point, you start adding more, you get a more fulsome map, you iterate, you change things that aren't working, you start exploring the limited format in more depth, start drafting, play more sealed, start applying it across multiple constructed formats. And it's just this iterative process from there. And it kind of snowballs and builds on itself. And then after all this time, you get to the end and you end up with a finished set. And it's almost kind of like magic where it came from. It is just now, we are very fortunate at LSS that it's not a lot of turnover. Like we have the same people who have been working on this for a very long time and we're learning more. Our processes are getting better. We're using technology better than we ever have and getting really good at it. We're getting really good at this process and understanding what works and what doesn't. And through that iterative process, we eventually get you the finished product that ends up at your local game store and leads to stuff like Rosetta, which I think Rosetta was a really good moment for us in terms of our process. It's the first set where we integrated some new technologies behind the scenes and got a really robust tracking system. It was the first set where Rohan became one of our senior developers, and he's been very instrumental in kind of shaping the flow of day-to-day work, scheduling, things like that.
Mm.
Whereas before there was more of a free-form process. He's really done a good job of getting us onto a tighter schedule and with a more organized approach to how we do this stuff. And I do think you can see the results of that in this set, especially in the limited format.
Yeah, because at a certain, you guys, like you said, don't have a lot of turnover. In fact, you've probably only added to your staff since the early days, as you've
For the
grown and
most
become
part.
bigger.
Yeah.
And yeah, at a certain point, you have a pack that you need to organize and lead. So that's great to
Yep.
hear. I'm glad you guys are responding well to structure, and I think in general, at any big organization, that's a key thing. There was something you mentioned in that process, which is where you're out of alpha phase and the set is released to the broader dev team. Um, my understanding of this process is that you're basically working with like blank sheets of paper, or at least something that is so much more rough around the edges than what we get on the back end. And if that's the case, is it hard at that point to connect with the fun, like the electric feeling that you get playing with these cards when they're finished? Um, and
I,
yeah, go
I don't
ahead.
think it is. I don't think so because like we're all so excited to have new flesh and like we still feel that same thing that the community feels when you get a new set, right? It's like cool, we get to work on something new now. And there's nobody on the team who doesn't love the game to the fullest. Like everyone is looking forward to engaging with new heroes and new cards. And I I get what you're saying. Like it is not a finished product, but at the same time, there's still that level of care and thoughtfulness and design. And oh, this is something new that we get to engage with that is kind of inescapable. And we kind of get to experience it twice, right? Like we get that moment where we get this new thing in the rough state. And then we get that moment where the set shows up to the studio for the first time in its actual finished form. And you get to rip open the first booster and be like, oh, this is what this feels like. This is what it looks like. And as much as I've done this for a bunch of sets now, you can't really anticipate that feeling until you open the pack and you see this thing you've worked so hard on like actually come to fruition. The big moment is when you see the hero art for the first time, when you
Oh
see the
yeah.
finalized hero art. It's such a, did this match the vision I had in my head? And the answer is usually no, but in the best way possible.
And I want to take that a step further. Can you point to any moments where like maybe even a design idea, like maybe it wasn't falling flat for you, but maybe it was like 80%. And then you saw like the art or the flavor text on it and you're like, oh no, this is a winner.
The most recent one is Florian. Like Florian's vibe sort of pushed it to the next level for me. I already liked Florian. Like I thought it was a very successful hero, did a lot of cool things. But when the final product, and I actually think like sort of all of Rosetta, I feel this way about. Like I felt very good about Rosetta after its completion. Again, particularly the limited format. Um, but once everything came together and you saw kind of the bright colors of Rosetta and these huge personalities that are present in these heroes and some of the weird stuff like Acilio being the giant mechanized thing that he is, that was not in my head as we went through the entire process. And the first time I saw it I was like, what's happening? I don't understand. But like the more I got used to Acilio being that construct and embracing it, I'm like, this is so cool. And it just speaks to like what a good job the creative team does. They really take these rough sketches and they always deliver something that is beyond my expectations for it. So I guess like I'm kind of at 80% for everything until I see the final form. And then they always find a way to get that extra 20%.
And then you're like, oh yeah, this is it. This is the
Yeah,
thing I
for
made.
sure.
That's really cool. Um, so let's shift gears a little bit. Let's get a little bit more in the nitty gritty. Um, design in general seems so difficult, given the fact that the more you add to the game, the more restrictions you're adding, which is kind of counterintuitive because you're like building worlds, going different places, but in reality, you've got more and more boundaries. Um, and I want to talk about how you stay ahead of it. And I want to point to a particular example that I think is poignant on this point, which is the preemptive banning of Berserk before Savage Sash came out. Um, how do you approach that on a day-to-day basis?
I think there are some specific things which are always on our radar. Interactions, risk cards. We certainly think about things in terms of risk matrix, and there are things we know that we're going to run up against at some point. Sometimes it's an individual card like Berserk. Sometimes it's a concept, drawing two cards at once, like with the book bannings that are going to eventually impose some limits on us. So we need to think in a few ways about that. We need to think about sort of counterplay to those things that are imposing these limits. You saw that with like Balance of Justice is a really good example of we're becoming aware of this presence of draw effects. So let's give a powerful tool back. And, that worked to some extent. Obviously, at some point, that was going to be overwhelmed, and it was. Um, or you can do very pointed things like this card cannot exist anymore. It just does not fit with our long-term goals, and you just preemptively ban something like Berserk. Both those approaches are fine. It just requires sort of an encyclopedic knowledge of all the pieces of the game, which obviously gets harder and harder. But, for us at this point, we live it. It's all we think about. It's all we do. It is, as I mentioned, a low turnover team that has been aware of these issues basically since their beginning. They know the risks that are present around some of these cards. They've been through so many development pipelines where, in fact, these cards did break and we changed other cards around them to make sure they were safer for a little bit longer. Or, we just had the conversation at the time of inception that, yes, we can do this, but we're introducing a risk down the road. And let's not be surprised if this is banned one day and accept that. I think you can't buy into the idea of infallibility of our game. Our game is going to break, it's going to crack, it's going to have fantastic metagames, it's going to have metagames that are maybe less enjoyable for more people. Again, that's part of the reality of this ever evolving thing. It's going to have a lot of different states. If you accept that and you're willing to adjust to those states and do what's necessary when presented with one of those states that ultimately is not good for the health of the game, I think it's fine. And I think you just need to communicate well enough with your audience, be respectful enough of the time and dollars that they're putting into your game, and then they will give you the trust to go ahead and be a stalwart of it and to manage it in an effective way. And I was really, really proud of how the Flesh and Blood community reacted to those book bannings. I think it said a lot about the environment we've created over these past few years, about the faith they have in us, um, and just about buy-in. Like they buy into the idea that we will do what's best for the game. And it could have been really easy to just have that take on a negative tone. Like we just saw in Magic where they banned cards and it was a disaster, like an unmitigated disaster. And I don't think that comes from them particularly making a bad decisions. Like in a vacuum, the decisions they made were fine. They were fine. They had a purpose, they had a goal. But I think the buy-in wasn't there. The belief in what they were trying to achieve, the communication may have been lacking a little bit. And you have to deliver on all that stuff if you're going to get the community to trust you with management and proactive management of the game.
Yeah, tell me more about what you saw from the Fab community. What did that look like on your end in the wake
Yeah,
of banning of the books?
uh, almost universal happiness, like a universal praise for resetting, for getting back to a slower pace of Flesh and Blood. Certainly, there's outliers, and I don't want to diminish their opinions either. There is a real cost to all of these bannings, and we don't take them lightly. We are aware that people may have bought Art of Wars the day before. That feels really bad, and we feel really bad about that. It's not something we want to do to people on a regular basis, and we will not do it unless we feel like we absolutely need to. So I don't want to diminish sort of the outlier voices who were unhappy with it, but by and by, people were just like, this seems smart for the future of the game. It seems like we can get back to a play style that maybe I enjoy a little bit more, and they just bought in and let us do it. And I think the Living Legend format existing also helped a lot with
Massively.
this whole process. I think it just gave a place, a home for these cards, a place for this play style too. Because despite the fact that we had to make this move, I don't want to diminish the folks who also enjoyed that explosive play style, the ability to do really powerful things. Again, I don't think it was the majority opinion, but there are folks who really enjoyed the experience of full powered Zen and not only playing it, playing against it.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't me trying to say it was not a mistake. It was. There was absolutely mistakes made there. But some people enjoyed those mistakes, and you have to be conscious of those voices too. Um, but long term, I think you have to look out for the majority, and I think average player was served really well by these bans.
This ties into something I wanted to talk about in reference to those very human fears you expressed earlier. You said that one of the reasons that you're so committed to LSS and their leadership is because they're constantly aware of who they're beholden to. And who in your minds are you and the rest of LSS beholden to?
Yeah, it's just the players. It's always the players. And the problem with that statement is that the players doesn't mean anything. Like it's such a broad swath, and that's where the challenge lies. Is you have to actually figure out what is best for your players, and sometimes that can look like going against what the again I'll use it with air quotes, majority is advocating for, because it's very hard to get a perspective of what the majority of Flesh and Blood players actually want, because the majority of Flesh and Blood players are not engaging with online platforms like Twitter. They're not in the YouTube comments section. They're in your local game stores. They're in callings around the world. They're the people I speak to at Pro Tours and World Championships. And again, that's not to diminish the other side. Twitter has a place. It is a very, very useful, store of information, but it can be echoey. It certainly reinforces your ideas and makes you feel like, yes, everyone feels this way. So they should certainly do these things. They're just being obtuse by not agreeing with me. Uh, and I've fallen victim to that too. Like I totally get that perception. But it's really hard to define what is best for the players. And we have to look out for a lot of folks at the same time. But regardless, it is always done in service of that nebulous concept. And I think as long as we're doing that, we're going to end up in a good place the vast majority of the time.
And that makes a lot of sense. And that actually makes me think of limited in general, because I think it pains me so much as somebody who loves limited so much in all card games that I engage with to ask this question. But it is so obvious that there is a dip in viewership at tier 4 events whenever draft is on broadcast. It's apparent to me at the armory level sometimes. Even when sets are fairly new, some people really don't want to engage in limited Flesh and Blood. So if we're listening to this majority voice, then it makes me wonder, like, what intrinsic value does limited provide to Flesh and Blood, and how does LSS justify keeping it around?
Yeah, to me, it's indisputable the value that limited puts on the table, and I think that is true throughout the company. We don't even question that for a second. And it is this mode of keeping things fresh, giving new things to engage with. And look, our limited formats are getting better, and we know they can continue to get better. And if people don't like limited now, I respect that opinion, but I'm going to do my best to change it. And we're going to continue to do our best to change it. And we're going to keep evolving how we present limited formats until we find one that speaks to you. Because I know one of the purest forms of TCGs is sitting with 7 other people around the table, building your deck on the fly, adapting, figuring out new strategies, having to play a different deck every single 3-round cycle. Like, that is just an inescapable part of TCGs for me. It's something I love so, so much. And I want to make sure our game is getting to the point where everyone loves that mode of playing Flesh and Blood. And if we're not there yet, all that means is we have more work to do. It's not there's something wrong with limited in Flesh and Blood. It's that we can do better at delivering a better limited experience. And we'll keep doing that. In terms of viewership, it doesn't bother me. Like, this is just constant throughout TCG's existence. And it's not so much an indictment of limited. It is more about why people engage with viewership of TCGs. Because you have to remember, there's sort of this elephant in the room when it comes to watching a TCG, is that I can choose to watch this TCG, or I could just go play it. And a lot of times you're going to choose to go play it instead. Like, why do you want to see someone else have this experience when you can do the same thing? Where this breaks down a little bit and where people really can buy in is with rooting interests. So personalities that they root for, stakes, high stakes, who's going to be the world champion. That can certainly get buy-in and cause you to say, I'd rather watch this than play this in this moment. The other thing that constructed formats can offer that limited formats cannot is repeatability of the thing you're seeing displayed before you. So you see Michael Hamilton show up to the World Championships with this crazy looking Icelander deck that nobody thought of. And then you can head to your armory the next night, copy that deck list, show up, do the same thing, replicate that experience. That drives a huge portion of constructed viewership. They want to see, what is this cool thing that I can also do? What can I add to my deck? How can I approach deck building for this hero in a way that I hadn't thought of before that this person's going to show me right now? When it comes to limited, you can learn something. And it's one of the reasons why I was a huge advocate for getting those actual drafts covered as part of our Pro Tour package. For a while, they fell out. And I will just be frank, I hated that. I was a huge advocate for getting them back on camera at the Pro Tour level. And thankfully, we have done that. And I think our game is better for it, because that is kind of the aspect of limited that you can repeat a little bit, you can learn from. But even that, you're not going to open the same pack. You're not going to be faced with the exact same picks that someone else is making. It's just kind of this broad power ranking. Oh, interesting, they took this card over this card. So there is not that same level of repeatability, especially when it comes to the gameplay in limited, because you're not going to face that matchup, because your opponent's Acilio deck is going to be different than camera person's opponent's Acilio deck, and your Florian deck that you drafted is going to look different than camera person's Florian deck that they drafted. It's just how it is. It's not a repeatable experience. So always going to have less viewership for limited. That's fine. We accept that. And we adapt to it. We cover fewer limited events, right? We don't make that a focal of our calling coverage circuit. We go way more often to CC events, and that's fine. We're totally happy with that. That doesn't mean that limited isn't important, though, and it's going to remain a huge part of Flesh and Blood for as long as I'm involved. I promise you, it drives so much of my focus and interest on this game. Without it, I don't know that I would have the same passion that I do.
You're preaching to the choir here, Bryan, and I'm really jazzed to hear you say all those things. You have a big announcement coming up in Osaka. We're announcing.
We always have big announcements.
There's always
something exciting to announce. Yeah.
But this is the most recent one, and it's the next set in Flesh and Blood. I have a question about it. That question is,
I'm probably not going to answer it, but you can shoot your shot.
I'm gonna try to give you an opportunity to be a slippery salmon and kind of weasel your way through it.
Okay.
In your opinion, what is the most exciting thing that this new set brings to Flesh and Blood?
I can't answer it. I know my answer immediately, and there's no way I can tell you. There's no way.
There's no like Bryan Gottlieb poker face, like try to get me to go down the right path.
No, there's nothing. Because that question sparked just such a clear answer for me, and I'm never going to lie to you, Bryce. I would never do that. So it just means I can't answer. I can't answer the question.
That's fine. I'll take that. That makes me even more excited, if I'm being completely honest. Okay, we are coming up on an hour. Do you have time to handle a little AGE Pro Team Mailbag?
Always time for you guys.
We've got a lot of questions that came in from all of my teammates, and some of them were pretty dang good. So I'm gonna give you just the good ones. How about that, Bryan? Okay. As is his right, this first one comes from the most recent Arcane Games and Events Players Champion, Zachary Wallach, who just took down that event last Sunday, if I'm not mistaken. I'm in a baby time warp, so it's hard for me to figure out sometimes. His question is, people like to focus on the mistakes devs make in missing some broken combo or card in testing, but he wants to know what's a specific moment where the player base surprised you genuinely and maybe excitedly by finding something cool or interesting that the devs missed or didn't really consider compared to internal testing?
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, I've talked at length about Zen, right? And the fact that we did test bonds, but our decks did not look like Pudding's List. And that first event, like literally watching the card guys versus Blue Pitch Showdown, I had this moment of, man, this guy's really good at building decks, and also, oh shit, at the same time. Like it was just simultaneous, like just being completely impressed, looking at how good his deck was, and immediately concerned. So that's the most recent one to come to mind. There's probably a cooler answer than that, like some unexpected build that I'm not thinking of.
Maybe the first time you saw somebody play a Count Your Blessings with a Count Your Blessings in the graveyard?
You know, I knew that was possible, and I can't say I was shocked by that happening. Um, yeah, I'm sure we could talk more about that particular card, but I think, you know, we're going to let that one play out. We're going to see how time shows Count Your Blessings as a strategy. And, you know, same procedure as always. We watch, we learn, we listen. But right now, I'm not overly concerned about Count Your Blessings. My opinion can always change in the future. So, yeah, that was a predictable one. I'll say that.
I'll take that, Brian. The next one comes in order of prestige, of course. This next one is from Austin Summers, who was a top 8 finalist at U.S. Nationals this last year in Minneapolis on Prism, no less.
Mm-hmm.
And wouldn't you believe it? It's a Prism question when it comes down to it.
Shocked.
It's all
Absolutely shocked.
it's all about allies. Austin basically wants to know, how do allies specifically fit into the design space, because it very much for a long time felt to him that illusionist was the ally class. They're the ones that play to the board.
Mm,
Everybody else kind of doesn't. Which, don't get me wrong, you printed, not you, but LSS printed Monarch, where Shadow Heroes had access to allies. But like, I guess he's asking nebulously, where do allies fit into the design space? Do you have to have a very specific flavor reason to include them in decks? Or in heroes, or is it more of a balance question for you?
I think it is both for sure. And I was the one who came up with Raise an Army for
Mm.
Kasai. So I think like I have some very clear thought processes that I had around that card as I was designing it that maybe can inform this question a little bit. Allies are, you kind of have to think of these things as like primary, secondary, and tertiary in terms of class identities. Like obviously there are class identities that are hard coded around allies, illusionists. Um, but I think there's going to be other classes that over time they reveal themselves to have secondary and tertiary relationships with allies as well. And they're going to do so at a moment that makes sense from both a gameplay perspective and a flavor perspective. With Raise an Army, when I proposed that card, it was literally just me sitting down, reading Kasai's lore. And this was a card that came into the process. Like I talked about how there's this early design sketch from James that hits the team, and there's holes in the map at that moment in time. So Kasai is firmly established as part of heavy hitters. We're developing around that, but there is a missing majestic, and we're trying to figure out exactly what to do with that. And sometimes when I'm brainstorming on that, I'll just go and read some lore and think about the story a little bit and just ask the question, why is Kasai at the deathmatch arena? Well, gold, money. Kasai driven by revenge. What does she want to do? Go back, avenge her father's deposition back in Volcor. And what are you going to do when you've made that gold? You're going to get your army together. You're going to hire some mercenaries. And it just was like, oh shit, this is exactly, not only is it telling exactly the progression of her story, it's exactly why she's in the deathmatch arena in the first place. It's interwoven with the mechanics that are already in place. It interacts with gold in a favorable fashion. And it just feels absolutely right. And, you know, I think upon seeing that card and seeing its influence over the way Kasai can shape her game plans, it just feels entirely right to me. Like it's one of the cards I'm most proud of because I think it nails it on every single front. It nails it on the storytelling front. It nails it on the gameplay front. Not only in terms of the like compartmentalized experience the card itself provides, but at how it interacts with Kasai's broader game plan. Like she is this grindy build value over time thing, and she needed this little bit of oomph, this little punch to get over the line. And this card doing so while ticking boxes very effectively just made me go to James and be like, look, I know we haven't done this yet, but like, this is it. This is the time to go ahead and make some warrior allies. And he's like, yes, it is. You're right. Let's do it. And I think that's going to be the scenario for when other classes start dipping their toes into allies. And that's not to, I don't want people to think like, oh, every class is eventually going to be about allies. Not at all. That's not the progression of Flesh and Blood. But it is a tool that we will use when it makes sense to do so. But there's going to be heroes and classes that are always pointed towards that onboard experience. And I would expect the illusionist class to be the flag bearer of that for a very long time.
And it's interesting because we've also experienced the antithesis to that illusionist maxim, shall we call it. Enigma doesn't have any allies.
Yeah, she creates her allies in her own way, right? It's like a unique wrinkle on the ally side of things. And I think that's really fun. I think it's cool to experiment with the idea of like, what does an ally actually mean? Do allies always need to take the form they are presently taking?
Mm-hmm.
I think Enigma sort of shows absolutely not. You can do allies in very different fashions. So again, like just coming back to my initial involvement with Flesh and Blood, you sort of see the potential, right? There's so many ways you can take this stuff. And I am very confident we have 15, 20, 30 years of design space left to mine in Flesh and Blood because there are the possibilities of going down all these roads and, you know, doing more not only with what does an ally mean, but what classes can interact with allies in different and unique ways. And we'll certainly see that over time.
30 years of design space down the line. Nothing makes me more excited, Bryan. All right, this next question comes from my co-caster at the AGE Open Series, Michael Murray. With so many different heroes and archetypes, are you happy with the current sideboard design and the amount of slots? If we are in an ever-expanding pool of heroes, will that someday need to be changed? Is that something that's on your radar?
So I've heard this discussed for a very, very long time. It was probably 2 years ago that I remember somebody first bringing me the idea of like, oh, should sideboards be bigger? And in fact, we basically did as much in Blitz. We opened up sideboarding in Blitz and gave you the opportunity to go ahead and get more sideboard slots. So I don't think it's a ridiculous question by any stretch of the imagination. However, I do think the limit is somewhat arbitrary. You're never going to have enough sideboard slots, and that's by design. Like you're not supposed to be able to account for everything. You were supposed to make decisions in the metagaming phase of a tournament. And again, this sort of loops back around to count your blessings. You are supposed to be able to assess, do I expect a large percentage of count your blessings in this particular metagame? Does it line up well? Can I go ahead and skimp on these slots and not engage with this in my sideboard? Those are interesting questions to me. I know some people don't feel the same. They want to be able to show up to every matchup with a plan. I'm going to present to you a reason why I believe it's important that's not the case. And it is churn. If you can solve everything, I mean, the description is right there. You have solved everything. What happens if everything is solved? Well, there's one answer. There's only one correct answer. And that's what you should be doing at every single tournament. And we've had metagames like that before. It gets boring. We want to be able to keep things fresh. We want you to be able to make metagame calls. We want you to be able to make metagame mistakes. And I understand in the moment that may lead to frustration. It may lead to you saying, I didn't have any way to go ahead and interact with the strategy. I played a deck that was just soft to it. Nothing I could have done. But there was something you could have done. You could have chosen a different deck. And maybe it just wasn't the time to play that deck. Or maybe you got caught out. Maybe you got caught out by that one complete buffoon who chose to play Count Your Blessings in a world where they absolutely should not be playing Count Your Blessings. But you know what? That person made a choice too. They made a decision. They chose to be that buffoon and take the gamble and they said, oh, maybe so and so will show up with this deck and I can exploit them. And maybe that shapes the meta in a certain way. And I can anticipate nothing but mid-range strategies who are going to get completely run over by Count Your Blessings in this tournament. Despite the fact that everything points to this should be an Enigma and Aurora meta, I think people are going to take the next step and they're going to bring, say, like Florian. They're going to bring Florian to these events, and I can punish that potentially with Count Your Blessings. That's cool too. That's very, very cool from a deck building standpoint, from a deck selection standpoint. And we have to offer those experiences. So I don't want to come off too unempathetic of the in the moment experience. It can feel really bad to play a match that you don't have a very large chance of winning when you sit down. But I think the question you have to ask yourself is, can I hedge? Can I make this a 20% matchup? Whereas before I would have left it as a 0% matchup. If the answer is yes, should you? Like, these are all interesting questions to me, and they're the things I loved engaging with as a deck builder. I think the people who kind of get caught really hard by this type of stuff and maybe the squeeze on sideboard slots are the specialists. The people who knew that they were playing Katsu before they left their house. Like, there's no question. They played Katsu at the last event, they're playing Katsu at this event, and they're playing Katsu at the next event. That can be tough. But you kind of make that choice when you engage as a specialist. You're going to have some metagames that are more favorable to you, and you're going to have some that are less favorable to you. And I think that's just something you sign up for when you engage in that fashion. So I hope this doesn't come off as dismissive. I'm very in tune with these complaints, and I think they have their place. And I think they do point to something that is real. It's a real thing you can experience. But the questions are often more multifaceted than, does playing this matchup feel bad? I can accept that playing that particular matchup can feel bad, like you don't have enough agency with your sideboard slots, and still say it is net positive for the tournament health of the game to force you to engage in this way. And I want to point out one more thing too. I think this becomes really, really true, and it becomes a bigger influence on your enjoyment of the game when you're not engaging through systems that are going through filtration. And what I mean by that is you're not playing a 7-8 round tournament where decks that are fringe strategies can be forced out as you progress through rounds. And you can say to yourself, oh, if I dodge this in rounds 1 and 2, I expect these other decks to beat it up, and then I'll be able to go ahead and succeed in this moment. If you are just sitting there jamming, let's say, 8 million games against a opponent that is somehow magically, I know this is not possible in the real world, but just say they just randomly were paired into you on some kind of magical platform that exists. And you had to just play whoever was put in front of you time after time again, all day long, just sitting there grinding out those games. I can see how that experience can feel really, really tough at times, especially when a new technology is like hot. Something like Count Your Blessings, where everyone's like, well, what if I put it in this deck? What if I put it in this deck? And then you're just facing it time after time again, because there's no filtration happening. And your deck that is being exploited by that one's strategy is going to get exploited time and time again. Whereas if that strategy is actually bad and you're engaging in a 9-round tournament, you maybe only have to get through rounds 1 and 2 with wins before you're actually facing the decks that were preying on that strategy that does not have a very high win rate. So just something to think about. Again, not trying to dismiss these complaints. I think they are valid, but in a very, very long-winded way, my answer to your question is I'm happy with the current size of sideboards, and I think they add something to the game where they're at.
I think I can hear a collective sigh of relief from deck box manufacturers everywhere. It's a beautiful thing. Let's move on to our next question, Bryan. This next one comes from teammate Moises Lopez. What do you think has been the most healthy premier aggro deck in Fab's history, and why?
KO comes to mind. Heavy hitters KO immediately comes to mind. I think it was a deck that was exploitable by a specific class. Warriors were very, very, very good at exploiting KO. And then sort of everyone else just had fine matchups into it. Like, certainly, I think KO was like 55% against a bunch of folks. But you could win. You absolutely could beat a KO. And sometimes they could high roll you and they felt like a premier unstoppable aggro deck, and that was within the range of possibilities. Sometimes they break at an untimely moment and they felt quite underpowered, frankly. And I think It's really funny. I got some heat during particularly the Heavy Hitters Pro Tour when I was advocating for the variance inherent in KO and as being a really good thing, a really positive thing for the game. But I do think that was a huge portion of why that deck succeeded so well as an aggro deck, because the next metagame sort of displayed what an aggro deck that had the variance stripped out of it could do.
Mm.
And that was Zen. Like Zen was the clearest example of I execute this very, very powerful plan every single time without fail. Well, then I can only interact with you on one specific axis. I have to disrupt that plan or I will die. That really, really narrowed the metagame down in a way that KO absolutely did not. You can just go back to that Pro Tour in LA and look at how diverse that field was. And I think that was because KO presented as a really, really healthy aggro deck. I see some of the same stuff in Aurora. I think Aurora maybe leans a little bit more towards the Zen side of thing in terms of reliable setup, but maybe without that same devastating spike. And maybe what Aurora does actually a little bit better than KO does is sidestep pivot. Like I think going to something like the Flicker Wisp plan, Flicker Wisp Arc Lightning plan in some matchups is a really, really nice sidestep that that deck provides. But in terms of like the moment to moment gameplay as an aggro deck, I think Aurora is proving herself to be in a very good place as well.
Definitely. Um, let's move on to our next question. This next one comes from our founder, Justin Lee Wong, and it goes something like this. Is there a particular design concept or approach that you take that was a firmly held belief of yours early on and that you have done a complete 180 on?
Hmm, that's an interesting one. I have to kind of think back to my early designs and things, how I was shaping things at that moment in time. You know, it's so interesting for me because I'll be frank, when I started working on Flesh and Blood, it was probably sooner than I should have been working on the game. Like, I still had so much to learn about the core game system. You have to remember when I started working with the company, I think I had been playing for like 3 months at that point in time.
Wow.
And I stepped into a world where, you know, James had like 10 years under his belt, and folks like Chris and Jason had been, I don't know, Chris almost basically the same length of time. He was with James from the beginning, playing early prototypes, and Jason well before release of WTRs. So I had a huge, huge amount of catch up to do, to the point where I was probably just designing a lot of simplistic stuff, like no risk stuff,
Mm.
um, wanting to play it very safe while still like misstepping because I didn't understand sort of fundamental math well enough at that point. Um, so in terms of like, maybe this is the best illustration. The more I think about it, so because of that mode of engaging that I'm describing, where I don't really know things well enough, I'm very hesitant to push up against limits, and particularly to push up against this sort of default power matrix that we have, you know, 2 for 6, 3 for 7, that type of thing. As time has gone on, what I've realized is that all of the most interesting Flesh and Blood cards find ways to break away from that matrix in a healthy fashion.
Mm.
So I no longer see my job as adhering to that matrix. My job is to find safe, fun, exciting ways to break from that matrix.
Know the rules so that you can break them.
Yeah. Yeah. And you really do have to have like a very good understanding of the fundamental rules to know when it's safe to go ahead and push up against them. And I think because I was lacking that early on, it's why I had to play things much, much safer. And, you know, I think that is reflected in early versions of the assassin class, right? Maybe with the exception of Codex of Frailty. Everything else is sort of very by the numbers, very safe. That's not to say it's bad. I mean, we just saw Azuri take down a Pro Tour, right? Obviously, there is something there. But I will point out she did so on the back of cards like Just a Nick, which I think is a very clear example of how do you go ahead and break Matrix safely? Well, you put some restrictions on it. and you make it only interact with very specific cards, and then you give a 0 for 5. We know the baseline for a 0 cost card, 0 for 4. Now you get a 0 for 5 with upside at attack reaction speed. That's a really, really powerful card, but it's an exciting one, and it's one you can build an entire identity around, and you have to figure out ways to go ahead and break in that type of fashion where it's safe to do so.
What you've said is so fundamental to like class identity in my mind in Flesh and Blood. For example, we have rules set out in Welcome to Wraith. This is how the combat chain works. This is how reactions work. And then like even in the next set, you have, oh, you know, these are heroes that do damage in a different way. This is arcane damage. This is not how the core game works, but we're breaking it a little bit. We have rangers who have super powerful attacks called arrows, but hey, you can only fire them once you've like pulled them out of a quiver and put them in your arsenal. Um, I think that is like so core to what makes games flavorful. Like establish a system, break it over and over and over again, but in interesting ways.
Yep. No, that is really the key. You have to find ways to break your system safely, and you have to find ways to let people cheat. Like they want to do things that are more powerful than they should be allowed to do. And they want to do so in a way that makes them feel like they discovered something, like they did something clever. And you have to go ahead and empower them to do so. Otherwise, your game becomes very, very boring. And
Otherwise, we're
there's
playing
a lot of,
chess.
yeah, exactly right. And there's a lot of games that I think showed a lot of promise at the start. And you can kind of go one of two ways. You can wholesale buy into this principle and just obliterate your game and make it ridiculously powerful and sort of take out a lot of the intricacy and nuance of it. Or you can play things way too safe and you can keep making the same kind of cards over and over and not really push the bounds. And I think there's good examples of both of that happening in the TCG space right now. And really, neither is good. You need to find out the sweet spot. You need to break your game in very uh, quote unquote safe ways. And if you try and do that, you're going to fuck up sometimes. And you have to be willing to live with those mistakes. Like that is the thing about Zen that I don't really regret is we took a shot. We tried something different. We tried something powerful. And I think the fact that we have now gotten Zen to a what I believe is a healthy place, it might even be an underrated place in the meta, speak to the fact that there wasn't this fundamental flaw. It's just we took a few too many shots and we got a couple things wrong. And yes, he's missing two extremely, arguably three extremely powerful cards from his kit that he had early on. But is that many? Is two that many cards when we have this massive universe of Flesh and Blood cards? Not really. It's really not. And to just be that close to being something that could have been part of the game safely and successfully, I won't say I have zero regrets. There certainly you wish you got it right the first time, but I don't think it was a catastrophe. I think it's just something that we're able to move forward from very successfully.
I have one last question for you, Bryan. And gotcha journalism is not anything we like to do here at the Arcane Games and Events Pro Team, but this one's a little spicy. This one comes from Bryce Flats. I guess that's a player on our team.
Mm.
It says, why do you insist on pronouncing Fyendal incorrectly? And at this point, are you just drunk with power and can't be stopped?
So
This is driving us all insane, Bryan.
here's we got into like my personal history a little bit. I'll share a little bit more personal history with you.
Hit me.
When I was young, very very young, I think I was like younger than 3 when I learned to read, and I was I think they term it hyperlexia, where it's somebody who learns to read at a very young age and then just reads and doesn't speak to human beings. That was basically me for like the first like 2 years I can remember, where I was just obsessed with books, reading all the time, and didn't really like speaking to humans all that much. One of the consequences of doing that is you make up your own pronunciations for these things you are reading because you understand kind of the words on the page before you hear them spoken. And the consequences of this have haunted me for now 41 years of my life. I am horrible at pronouncing everything. And I also don't have this thing inside me that tells me you should learn to say that properly. like I try to be very conscious about it because I think it's disrespectful when it comes to someone's name to not take the time, learn their name properly. So in that instance, I slow myself down and I go, no, wait, you have to learn this, take the time and figure it out. When it comes to words, I just learned to say segue, not as segue, about like 4 years ago because it looks
Whoa.
like
Right.
SEGUE. And I would just say segue all the time out loud. And everyone would kind of look at me. And it took until somebody called me out on a YouTube comment to be like, oh, maybe I need to adjust this. Because, like I said, this was only a few years ago. Um, so yeah, there's a bunch of sticky pronunciation in my life. I probably like read the word once, locked it in my brain, and now I'm just committed. I don't even know how I say it, so I'm just saying the first thing that comes to mind, Fyendal spring tunic. That's probably wrong, right? That's incorrect.
Honestly, I think if Dryce Flats were sitting here right now, I think he would think that was just something you did. It was like an oldheim oldham thing, and that
Fyendals.
we would just have some fun with that. But now he's probably
Yeah,
feeling a little bit bad.
I have no idea. I have no idea how it's actually pronounced. When it comes to your name, if I ever pronounce it wrong, or if I'm doing coverage of a match, any of you out there, you come tell me. I'm sorry. I don't. I want to get that right. When it comes to words I pronounce wrong, I don't give a shit. I'm committed to the bit at this point. I'm just gonna keep doing it forever.
Hmm. Well, thanks for having some fun with me with that, Brian, and thank you for being here. I have one final thing, and it's the
Mhm.
first thing I asked. Why card games? I think you maybe have a little bit different answer than when we first started.
I I can probably come up with a million answers. That's why they're always going to be different, right? I can just tell you everything about it, but it always just comes back to what they have offered to my life, the relationships I've formed through them, the way they occupy my brain, the career. Lost an AirPod there. The career that they have now inspired for me. There's just so much that I get from them, and I could sit here and sing the praises of card games till the end of time. So pick one of a million reasons, but it's going to be card games for the rest of my life for sure.
Terrific, Brian. Well, thank you so much for being here and giving us so much of your valuable time. I, for one, look forward to the day that you open your animal sanctuary and I never see your face on YouTube again. But in the meantime, thank you so much for being here and thank you for being such a strong ambassador for a game that is so near and dear to all of our hearts.
My pleasure. And thank AG. I want to thank AGE for bringing us amazing coverage week after week. I really do watch the vast majority of shows that you guys put on. And you in particular, Bryce, I am extremely impressed with your just natural flair for casting. I think you understand it. Not only are you good technically, really good at calling a match, but I think you understand the role really well. I think you understand, what you're there to accomplish. And that's rare. That's something that people often have to be taught over time. And I don't know your background. Maybe it's just you're, been doing this for a long time. If not, though, that's even more impressive. Like I think you have done a tremendous job stepping into that casting role, and I want to see a lot more from you in the future. So
Well, just try to stop me. That's what I say. I'm incredibly green, but I'm absolutely loving what I'm doing, and you won't be able to stop me from doing it.
good,
And
good. That's what I like to
I'm
hear.
somebody who likes to be thrown in the deep end. I think kind of like you, Brian.
Hmm. That's the way to do it, man. You learn on the fly for sure.
Well, and since Brian said you learn on the fly, that's been our time with Bryan Gottlieb today. Thanks to him once again for a magnificent interview. And stay tuned for more Arcane Games and Events content coming your way shortly. Have a good day, everybody.